Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." As I look around our country today, I see a lot of history repeating itself. The question is, will the American people remember the past, or are we condemned to repeat it? Well, we'll ponder that next on the Constitution Study.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here with the Constitution Study, where we read and study the Constitution and we teach a rising generation to be free. I'm glad you could join me. As always, I'm going to ask you, please head over to the website, constitutionstudy.com, to where you can find everything I'm working on. You can sign up for the newsletter. I send out updates once a month. You can even check the box, have this material delivered to your inbox when I release it twice a week. Don't worry about Facebook. Don't worry about YouTube. Algorithms don't matter. I send it directly to you. It's also where you can check out the store or other articles or other ways that we can engage and work towards preserving liberty and the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. So let's talk today about history repeating itself. There are so many examples of history repeating itself today. Now let's take a look at some of them. Now, I've talked before about the riots. They remind me of the riots of the late 60s and early 70s. Those involved a lot of college students protesting the war in Vietnam and a lot of blacks protesting their treatment in society. Sound familiar? Now, whether it's the war against the police or the cries of white privilege, it sounds very similar to what we heard 50 years ago. And don't forget the racial segregation. No, I'm not talking about black people being sent to the back of the bus or white-only lunch counters. I'm talking about black-only areas of the occupied territories in Seattle and the bowing and shining of black people's shoes. Isn't it amazing? 57 years after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech about his children going up in a land where they are judged by the content of their character, we are still judging people by the color of their skin. Only now it's not to keep blacks out of certain schools or laws that deprive them of their rights. Today it's about punishing people for the sins of their ancestors, whether they or even their ancestors actually owned, slaved, or acted in racist ways. Is there still racism in America? Yes, and I'm seeing it more and more. No, I'm not talking about Jim Crow style laws. I'm talking about the hatred so many people are showing for men and women who have done nothing to harm them, and in many cases have worked very hard to help them, but simply because of the color of their skin. Is this any different than the treatment of Jews in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia? Are we acting any different than those in China who abused the Japanese only to have the tables turned in the late 1930s? Then we saw the statues being vandalized and torn down. Now let's forget the question of defacing and destroying both public and private property, at least for a moment. When in history have we seen statues torn down? Yes, statues were torn down when the Soviet Union and Saddam Hussein fell, yet only the statues of the fallen government were targeted. So if only Confederate statues were targeted, I could chalk this up to a delayed reaction to their defeat. But then other statues were targeted. Washington, Lincoln, Columbus, even statues of Frederick Douglass and those honoring people who were lynched and the 2nd Black Regiment in the Union Army to fight in the Civil War. No, this is not about getting rid of statues of a fallen government. Now, where else have we seen historic monuments destroyed? Well, the Taliban and ISIS destroy statues and monuments of other religions. Statues were destroyed during the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Cultural Revolution in China. Those remembrances of history that did not comport with the modern revolutionaries' view of things were destroyed in an attempt to erase history, just like what's happening today. And speaking of the Cultural Revolution in China, let's compare that to what's happening today. You see, between 1966 and 1976, under the guise of purging the Communist Party of bourgeois attitudes, young people, some in uniform, others just wearing red armbands, dragged their neighbors into the street to be humiliated and publicly beaten. Many vandalized ancient temples and sacred relics, all in an attempt to protect China from ideas that didn't match with Chairman Mao's beliefs. Others were forced to submit to struggle sessions for holding ideas that were thought to be bourgeois. Scholars, traditionalists, educators, even people simply accused by their neighbors of committing counter-revolutionary crimes were subject to these mock trials. The victims were forced to wear hats and signs as badges of their dishonor before the jeering crowds. They were forced to confess their alleged crimes, or they were beaten, sometimes to death. Now compare that to parts of America today. Not just those running around in black masks, destroying statues in the name of Black Lives Matter, but the requirement not just to abide by, but promote this agenda of vandalism, under penalty of public ridicule and attempts to destroy those who disagree. There are even those who propose more severe reactions, like the recent Harvard graduate who tweeted that she'll stab anyone who says all lives matter, or the leadership of the Seattle insurgency calling for violence in the name of their cause. China was not the first. I remember reading about Germany's brown shirts, the Hitler Youth, and the Soviet Youth. And today in America, we have not one, but several youth violence organizations. Are we doomed to repeat history? See, I remember Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and Che Guevara, individuals and groups who confronted dissent with intolerance and violence. I remember hundreds of thousands who risked their lives to escape such countries, who braved being shot for escaping Soviet bloc countries or shark-infested waters to leave Vietnam, Cambodia, and Cuba. As a nation, have we all forgotten our history? And if America falls to these Marxist revolutionaries, where will we escape to? I also remember those in positions of influence, churches, education, and the media, who acted as indoctrinators and propagandists for these horrible movements. And not just those in the affected countries, but those of the West as well. I read how the New York Times covered up genocide in the 1930s. And I've watched as American news outlets maliciously misreport events in Israel and throughout the Middle East. And they've done so for decades. If Santayana is right, if those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it, then is the opposite true as well? Is the way to avoid the mistakes of the past to remember them? Well, if that is true, then I suggest there's one more step that must be taken. It is not enough to simply remember the past, but to act when you see history repeating itself. Now, if that is the remedy for the madness we currently find ourselves in, then this is what I propose we do. I believe the vast majority of Americans neither believe nor condone what has been going on the last few months, not the actions of government or of the insurgents. And it is time we stand up and say enough is enough. First, we must hold our elected officials accountable, not just in the next election, but in all those that follow. Any elected official who has failed in their duty to protect the rights of their citizens is derelict in their duties and a traitor to their oath. I know, those are strong words, but they accurately describe the situation in many of our cities. How many mayors have stood back and let these rioters and vandals terrorize neighborhoods with impunity? How many elected officials have come out in support of what these insurgents are doing? Each and every elected official swears or affirms in their oath of office to support the Constitution of the United States, and except for federal offices, of their state as well. If they are unwilling to do so, then they are a traitor to that oath. They are unqualified to hold any office of public trust and should be treated accordingly. Now, unlike those in Seattle, Washington, D.C., New York, and numerous other cities, they should not be met with violence, but the refusal of all who remember history to vote for them. And for those elected officials who are promoting this violence or calling for the dismantling of our country, they should be considered persona non grata for any elected office as well. Will all of these traitors to their oaths be removed? No. Sadly, many of them actually represent their constituents and their beliefs. But unless the majority of Americans who are willing to listen and work on the grievances of others without violence choose better leaders, those who are promoting violence will grow and become stronger. Next, there is ample evidence of the malfeasance in the corporate news media, not to mention malpractice of our institutions of higher education. We must stop submitting ourselves and our children to these re-education centers. Unless your chosen career requires a higher education degree, like a doctor or a lawyer, don't go, and don't send your children. If you can find a school of higher education that does not indoctrinate in Marxist propaganda, well then support them with your tuition dollars. But a college degree is less and less a requirement for a meaningful, fulfilling, and yes, profitable career. By the way, I do not have a college degree and I spent 30 years in a very successful career in IT. Why would we support those institutions who are working to remove our own freedom? And if corporate news organizations of all shapes and sizes have shown themselves to be little more than propaganda outlets, why do you support them? Why do you act like those who submitted to the struggle sessions? No one is dragging you into the street to humiliate you if you don't buy the New York Times, watch Fox News, or subscribe to CNN. There are plenty of sources of news available today, and most of their stories can be vetted for accuracy and viewpoint discrimination. So why do we keep going back to what we know is a polluted source of information? Now, unlike so many of those, and CHOP, BLM, Antifa, and the other groups that are trying to overturn our rights, I don't want to shut them up. See, as long as they are not infringing on the rights of others, they are free to believe and speak as they wish. I will not ask them to bow to my perceived complaints. I will not try to destroy their lives and their livelihoods for thinking differently. However, I will oppose any attempt for them to force their beliefs on others. If they cannot win over people to their point of view through discourse and debate, I will not stand by and let them do so by force. So this episode has been a little different. And you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with the Constitution? Well, the answer is simple. Does the Constitution even matter anymore? If we're going to let insurgents take over portions of cities and set up their own areas with their own rules and their own laws, does the Constitution matter? The Constitution of the United States says it was created to secure the blessings of liberty, both for those who signed it and for their posterity. How do you secure the blessings of liberty when those who are trying to take your liberty are in charge? This did not happen overnight. This has been building for years and for decades, and there have been plenty of people warning. History has been repeating itself, and we've sat back and watched it happen. At least too many of us have. So if we believe in the Constitution, if we believe in unalienable rights, if we want to live free, then we must decide to stand up against those who don't want us to live free. Do some of them have legitimate grievances? Absolutely, and those should be addressed. They should be done properly. Is America perfect? Does it need things fixed? Absolutely, and it should be done peacefully and properly. But when you're using a platform to impose your will on others, to force people to comply, to humiliate them and destroy them if they don't, you are not promoting a free people. You are a tyrant. You are a Marxist. You are promoting totalitarianism. And we've seen 100 million plus people killed by these Marxist regimes. And we want to go back to that? Now you can sit back and say, well, there's nothing I can do, and watch as your children's future goes from a future of freedom and liberty to one of tyranny and such a desperate situation that hundreds of thousands of people risk life and limb to get away from it. If America falls, where do we run? If America is no longer the land of the free, where do we escape to? If people were willing to risk their lives to get away from this, why are we running headlong towards it? I believe it's because a very small number of people are doing so, and they're getting a lot of attention and a lot of exposure and a lot of propaganda support, and too many Americans are sitting back and letting it happen. If you hired a mayor to protect your rights and they failed to do so, they sat back and said, well, let this Chaz, Chop, whatever they want to call it, we'll just let them do their own thing for a while, then they should be viewed as derelict in their duties. They are a traitor to their oath. I'm not saying they should be dragged out and shot. I'm just saying they're disqualified for office. And when we have Congress people saying they want to overturn our political system, that's a violation of their oath. They swore to support the Constitution. What are we doing about it? Again, if that represents the will of their people, the question is that the majority of Americans? We need to stop looking solely at ourselves. We need to look at the bigger picture, at the rights of everyone. We need to stop choosing our leaders because they look nice or they say flowery words, but what do? They work for you. They're your servants. If Ilhan Omar, AOC, Governor Newsom, if these people aren't representing your point of view, why do you keep rehiring them? If they do represent your point of view, that's really what you want to live in. Read your history. Read what happened when the Nazis took over in Germany, when Lenin took over in Russia, when the revolution happened in France, when Pol Pot took over in Cambodia. Read your history. And if you don't want to repeat it, then learn from it. Remember it. Let's find a better way to deal with our differences. And hopefully that gave you food for thought. And I'll see you here the next time on the Constitution.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through